We've got an exciting speaker coming up right now. His name is Alan Nicol. He's the co-founder and chief technology officer of Rasa Technologies, the most widely used conversational AI development tool or platform. The title of his presentation is Conversation-Driven Development. Take it away, Alan.
Thank you very much for the intro. Nice to meet you all. Great to be here and get the chance to talk to you a bit about conversation-driven development. This is, of course, very closely tied to AI assistance and conversational AI. So I'll talk a little bit about both of those things and how the methodology of CDD helps drive better outcomes. So very briefly, just a little bit of context of what we're talking about here. So AI assistance includes anything where the primary interaction is through spoken or written language, right? And we see this as the next evolution of ease of use and accessibility of all kinds of software, right? Going from, of course, the days of mouse and keyboard, which were big revolutions at the time, to touchscreens, and now increasingly being able to control software just by saying what we want in our own language. And so this reduces the barrier to becoming, quote unquote, computer literate, and makes it possible to build products and services that reach far, far more people globally. Oh, sorry. This is also hugely relevant for enterprises because what we've seen companies do over the last couple of decades is increasingly build options for their customers to, self-serve on their support needs, right? So every large company these days has, a web presence, typically a mobile app, lots of different ways that you can, achieve different things that you need. Nonetheless, a lot of customers still end up, picking up the phone and calling and ending up in a contact center, right? Why is that? I mean, ultimately, it's because these large companies are imposing all of the work on the end user, right? They're imposing their org charts on their end customer and saying, oh, you're not talking to this team, you got to be talking to this team, right? And so the promise of conversational AI is to do away with that, right? And say, have the same level of service as if you were sitting down with a representative of the company and they're there to figure out how they can help you rather than you trying to navigate, all their products and services to figure out the right thing that you need done. And so Rasa is an open source platform for building AI assistants. It's, as the introduction said, it's by far the most widely used platform in the world. And it's been adopted by really the largest companies in the world across all these different verticals, right? Healthcare, insurance, banking, retail, technology, telecoms, and manufacturing. And in just a few years since we launched, the product's been downloaded over 10 million times, right? It's a very, very widely used platform for building these assistants. And just a couple of examples before we get into the meat of how we think about developing assistants. The philosophy behind it, the methodology of CDD, maybe just give you a couple of examples of these large companies who are building better experiences for their end users, right, that are more akin to how their users want to interact with them using our technology, right? So T-Mobile, obviously a tier one enterprise, has many, many millions of customers, giving users the option to self-serve via a conversational assistant and saying, hey, look, if you don't want to wait in line for the contact center until an agent is available, it's very likely that the conversational AI assistant will be able to help you with this query, right? They had some pretty spectacular results when they migrated from their previous technology to moving to Rasa, and have just been a stellar example of a company that really truly puts the customer first and make sure that the assistant is adapting to the way that users talk rather than expecting users to learn how to curate what they say so that the assistant can understand it. Another example is JPMorgan Chase. They also have their flagship AI assistant helping customers, also developed with Rasa technology. And it's embedded within their mobile app, right? And can do all sorts of things for you. You can, check balance, transfer money. You can, freeze and replace cards and all sorts of, general admin tasks that you can do, instantly, 24 hours, anytime you like, without having to wait or talk to a human or anything like that. And so these are, of course, large companies with a huge array of products and services. And the way that you, as a large enterprise, divvy up the world might not be the same way that your users talk to you, right? So if a user asks about a transfer, there might be, half a dozen or more different types of things that you could do for them to help them make a transfer, whether that's international or via, Zelle or Venmo or whatever else it might be. And so, it's your job to figure out how to help the user, right? The user's not being ambiguous. The user's just telling you what they want. So all of this is just to motivate the point that to build truly good assistants have to speak the user's language. And so that brings us to the 5 levels of conversational AI, which provides a frame, in which we can think about the progression of building more sophisticated AI assistants, and similarly how the developer and the processes of the team that are building these assistants have to evolve in tandem. And so here's a model. These are the 5 assistants. Of course, it's just one way to think about sophistication. But this is our maturity model for thinking about, how to build better conversational AI, how to truly bridge this gap between, complex organizations and their customers. So I'll go through, all of these examples of, how we define these different levels of sophistication. But the point I want to make with this slide is just that in parallel, in tandem to us building more sophisticated assistants, we also have to evolve how we think about building these tools and truly embracing that they have AI at their core. And there are certain good things from regular software development that we can and should and must bring over. And there are certain things that we absolutely shouldn't, that we absolutely need to let go of and rethink. So level 1 assistants. A level 1 assistant can be a form on a website, or it can be a command line app. But what defines a level 1 assistant is that the user gets one chance to provide a valid, set of input, right? It all has to be in one command. So if I take the example here of getting a quote for a mortgage, right? Of course, there's some, input parameters that are required to provide that mortgage quote, right? The amount of money you need to borrow, the amount of duration, the type, if you want a fixed or a variable rate mortgage. And so if we think about this as like a web form or a command line app, you provide these pieces of information and you get out a mortgage quote, right? And it's of course much easier than doing a hand calculation with a bunch of tables and a handheld calculator, right? So it's still very convenient. But as you can see, I have to be an expert user to use this, right? I have to know exactly what input I have to give and what valid inputs are for each of these things. I really have to understand a lot about the domain. And so as we progress from level 1 to something more usable and something more user-friendly, what we're doing is that we're lowering the burden on the end user to translate what they want into a language that we can understand, right? So rather than saying, here is my API, here is my domain-specific language, go and learn it and give me a valid input, it's saying, how can I increasingly accommodate that you are a human and you live in your reality, and it's my job to figure out how to help you. And so chatbots have been around for a while. Basic chatbots, I would consider level 2 assistants, right? And so what the user experience looks like is that in this case, the user can tell you, right, in their own words, that they're interested in mortgage rates, right? And they're then guided through the process, right, and being asked for, the relevant input that they need. So they don't have to know all of this a priori. It's a kind of guided experience. They can provide the input, in a sort of natural language form that makes sense to them, right? In this case, there are a couple of buttons, right? That makes it even more convenient and easy, so you don't have to know what the options are. You can just tap one. Now, things get interesting when you start to talk about level 3 assistants, right? So the defining feature of a level 2 assistant is that you have a particular path you're supposed to go down. And if you deviate from that path, things fail very quickly, right? And so when you start to give real users access to assistants, you will see this happening very quickly, that people have follow-on questions, right? Or you ask them for information and they don't know the answer, right? Or they ask why you need to know that. Or they change their mind about the thing they said earlier, or they make some chit chat or whatever else it might be, right? There are infinitely many conversations that can be had, which don't all follow your prescribed path. And so in this case, if users have follow-on questions, they want to do a deep dive, something like that. In this case, the person wants to compare that to renting, that within a very narrow domain, we are able to have, a flexible conversation that still achieves the stated goal at the start, which is, I want to get a mortgage quote, right? Which is stated quite clearly and unambiguously by the user. So that's a level 3 assistant. Is we're no longer putting things on guide rails. We're giving the user the chance to, deviate from just purely following the prescribed path without things falling apart completely. Level 4 assistants take it up a notch, where now the user goal can be implicit in what they say. So in this case, the user saying, my kids have gone to college and I want to downsize, right? Now, as developers, we might look at this and go, okay, well, that's ambiguous input. But that's the wrong way to think about it, right? What the person is telling you is perfectly clear. This is an important piece of information they're telling you about their lives. The thing that's ambiguous is you don't know how to help them, and that's your job to figure out, right? So giving the user the ability to tell you about their situation, to tell you about the goal that they wish to achieve, without necessarily specifying specifically the task that they want you to do, the form they want you to fill out, the service they want you to provide, because it's your job. It's your job to figure that out. And then when we get to level 5 assistants, we're not just able to, take these implicitly stated goals and refine them and figure out how to help the user, but we can actually adapt in real time to the level of detail and the particular experience that any user wants, right? So if a user comes in with a statement that is as precise and well thought out as this one, this person clearly knows the lingo, knows a lot about mortgages, we wouldn't give them the same experience of just walking them through a couple of steps, right? This person clearly knows a lot more than the basics, and we can pick up on that and customize the experience for them, right? Because users don't interact with these assistants once and then go away forever. If you're a bank, hopefully you have this customer for many, many years, right? For decades. And they're going to come back to you and they're going to have more follow-on questions about their particular situation, right? And again, it's about lowering the burden on the end user to do that translation for you, and for you to instead accommodate the user. And so those are the 5 levels how you can think about, this maturity model for AI assistants being ever more helpful. And one of the really key practices that enable you to get there is something we call conversation-driven development. And so before we get into how it works, I want to slightly motivate why we need a term, a philosophy, a technology for thinking about this. So if any of you have built a chatbot or any kind of a voice bot or any kind of conversational AI before, you will know that 1, it's very hard. 2, that when you're building a prototype, it all seems easy. That's not the hard part. And the hard parts, the challenges don't show up until you start to go from the prototype to something you want to put in production, right? The devil is very much in the detail. And so the reason for having this kind of philosophy and this practice is to help all of us build better conversational AI. But even more importantly, to save people who are new to the field from having to learn all of this the hard way, right? It happens just far too often that a team that's new, it's been tasked to build a chatbot, they go off into the mountains for a few months and build some stuff, they bring it to customers and it just falls flat. That's the problem we're trying to prevent with CDD. And so the first thing to recognize is what's demonstrated in this diagram, right? There are far more things that your users will say to your assistant than you can ever possibly anticipate. And the way that they behave is very different from the way that you would talk to the assistant as someone who knows about the domain, knows what the assistant is capable of, knows what it can do, right? This has nothing to do with the technology you use. This has nothing to do with whether you're using deep learning or anything else. It's got nothing to do with that. This is just a fact of life, right? That we have to confront. If we're a team building something inside an organization, we cannot anticipate all the things that people are going to say. So the key to building a good experience is making these circles overlap, right? How do we make sure that there's a high degree of overlap between the kinds of conversations that our assistant is capable of having and the kinds of things that users are actually going to say, the kinds of conversations that they actually want to have, right? And that's very simple, probably uncontroversial, but that's really the key behind CDD, right? The challenge in conversational AI is that you give people a free text box or a telephone number they can call, and they can say anything they want, right? It's not like when you build a mobile app and you give them a few buttons to click, they can say anything, right? So that's the challenge. The opportunity is that they're telling you exactly what they want in their own words, right? So we just, quote unquote, just have to listen to what they're telling us. And I mean that in a very literal sense, like actually listening, right? And using those insights to improve our assistant over time. And that's what CDD is all about, that iterative process of learning from users, closing that feedback loop, and building a better assistant. And so CDD is made up of 6 actions, right? Share, review, annotate, test, track, and fix. And the first thing I'll say about it is that it's not like 6 steps in a linear process, right? These are activities you will do continuously, and you will jump backwards and forwards between them all of the time. You can't ignore any of them. They're all absolutely crucial. So maybe to not go into too much detail, but talk a little bit about what each of these steps is. Share. This one you really cannot, if you only take one thing away from this whole talk, it's that if you want to build an AI assistant, as soon as you have the most basic hello worldy kind of example of it, give it to some of the people you expect to use it, or at the very least, give it to some of the people outside of your team to give it a test run. They will always surprise you. Better to get exposed to that sooner rather than later, right? If there's one take-home message from this, it's please share early, right? It has never happened that people built an AI assistant in a team without lots of user testing and then just pushed it out to the world and that it worked. That has never happened, and your project will not be the exception. The second one is to review, right? People are having conversations with your assistant. You're going to be improving it over time. Of course, it's important to look at metrics and numbers and KPIs and how things are doing, but don't forget to look at actual conversations, right? Like you can see the exact user experience. You can replay it in your head. You can imagine how this person felt, and you can see what they were saying. And the human brain is just a much better pattern matcher than anything else. And you can empathize and understand where people are struggling, right? So don't forget to actually look at the conversations people have. Third one, annotate, right? People are saying things to your assistant that won't have been part of your training data. Annotate those so that you close the loop and they become part of your training data, right? You cannot train a good assistant on synthetic data, right? You need to be training your models on the same kind of data that you're asking the model to make predictions about. And you're always using your model to make predictions about real user messages. So you should be training it on real user messages. Fourth one, testing, right? This is crucial, and it's absolutely vital to building any kind of high quality software, right? So as I said at the start, there are plenty of things from other kinds of software development that we really ought to bring towards any kind of AI product development, right? Or AI software development. And the fact that we can build and run regression tests and unit tests and everything else is absolutely vital, right? You wouldn't ship any kind of production software without having a bunch of tests. And so why should a conversational AI product be any different. Track, super important to track, the conversations that are successful and unsuccessful. This can be actually very nuanced and really strongly depends on your application. Typically, the things that tell you that a conversation was successful or not actually happen outside of the conversation. They're not things that you can necessarily tell just by looking at the transcript of the conversation, right? Like if the user took an action inside the mobile app, or if they didn't do something, right? Maybe they didn't get back in touch because their problem was resolved, right? All sorts of signals that might make sense to you. Sometimes it's enough to just have something that happened inside the conversation, but you need to somehow track, how many conversations are being successfully helping the users and which ones aren't. And then finally fixing, of course, once you're tracking where, users are having the most problems, where your model's not understanding things, where your code has bugs, as with any other kind of software development, you want to, keep track of those, prioritize them, and just knock them out. And so conceptually switching from, what I would regrettably say is the default method of building chatbots to CDD is analogous to going from like waterfall to agile development, right? And so why do companies adopt agile development, right? It increases your speed to market, your flexibility and agility, but most importantly, it helps you develop the right product, right? Because rather than gathering a bunch of requirements in the abstract and then implementing against those requirements, you actually get this continuous feedback loop with real users. Once they see it, they can have a more nuanced conversation about what their real needs are. The same thing is true for CDD, right? It very much increases time to value, right? Because, the first versions, of course, are always going to be bad. That's not a reflection of your team or your technology. That's just the fact of life. And so you want to use those insights as quickly as possible to improve your assistant, right? And similarly, you want to be building the right product, right? You're going to be growing your circle of assistants, conversations your assistant can have. You want to make sure that that circle has lots of overlap with the conversations people are actually having. You can grow your circle very large, and if it doesn't have any overlap, you're just doing a bunch of busy work. So yeah, from a business perspective, of course, we have to make the case always, from a business case perspective of why this is a better approach to building AI assistants. I mean, it's three things really. You increase the ROI, you do a better job of helping your customers, and you have a more efficient process because you don't waste time building things that people don't need. And CDD, I would say, is very much a team effort, right? So final couple of slides, I'll just show a little bit about how we see this playing out in these large teams that we work with. And the reason it's a team effort is that it really requires a range of skills and knowledge and experience, right? So of course, there are software skills involved in, debugging some code or implementing a new integration that you didn't have before. There are data science skills required, right, to understanding why a model might be confused about something or how you can improve it. But equally important to those technical skills, you need people on the team who are subject matter experts, who are deeply knowledgeable about the kinds of people who are going to be using the assistant, the types of things they want it to do, and the way that they might talk about those things, right? So to build a really intuitive, friendly level 3, 4, 5 assistant, you can't just do that with a technology approach. So there are a whole bunch of different roles. I already hinted at one of them. Again, I might not go into each of these in detail. These slides will be shared with you afterwards, of course, so you can, to your heart's content, go and read about it. And we see teams of different sizes adopting this practice. So it's not something that you can only do if you've got like a 20 or 25 person team. It's absolutely something that lean teams can and should and must adopt, right? Because again, it's not driven by technology or anything like that. It's just driven by the fact that, you can't anticipate what people are going to say. So finally, as I wrap up, I have a whole bunch more resources on CDD and conversational AI. There's some links here you can check out. There's a CDD playbook online. There's a LinkedIn group for people who are interested in this topic. There are templates you can use for project managing these kinds of projects. More enterprisey perspectives again, and some more detailed sort of technology insights. And I would also highly recommend the Rasa YouTube channel. So if you just search YouTube for Rasa or Rasa Chatbots or something, you should find it pretty quickly. It's wildly popular. We have lots of free content in education about the depths of NLP, how transformers work, how different algorithms work, how chatbots are built, how Rasa works, lots of tutorials and great content. So I would also very highly recommend you check out our YouTube channel. And with that, I'm done. So I'm more than happy to take your questions. And thank you all for listening.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks for that great presentation. I, for one, cannot wait till this conversational AI becomes ubiquitous so that I don't have to push 500 buttons on my telephone when I want to get in touch with somebody about a problem. So thanks a lot for that. What I would like to ask is all our attendees or those that want to go to the polls and let Alan know how you liked his presentation. In the meantime, there is a Q&A session, so let's get started. I'm going to have to put on my glasses for that. And let's get to the first question. From Jolt Barachi. Can you talk about design best practices? Like, do you develop the input potential flow output and add classifiers to them, or rather define start end and let the AI fill in between based on samples?
Yeah, it's a very good question. The design process for any kind of AI assistant is very iterative, right? And so even before implementing, I would highly recommend, using paper mockups, or even like a Wizard of Oz technique, where you literally pretend to be the chatbot yourself. You connect with humans, and you see what they say, right? Because if your brain can't deliver a good experience, then the artificial brain that you develop certainly isn't going to be capable of it, right? So it can really give you good exposure to, whether these conversations feel natural, whether they feel good, whether they seem right. Apart from that, I will say that I am not a deep expert on conversation design. There's an excellent book on the topic. It's called Conversations with Things. It's a great resource. I would highly recommend reading it. It's also a very practical guide on, lots of techniques and things that you can do.
Thank you. Next question from Ferenc Kukuchka. What are nowadays state-of-art chatbot solutions technologies from a deep learning perspective?
Yeah, for sure. So of course, all of the platforms out there these days are leveraging, the leaps in, better representations that have been, coming out in the last couple of years. Obviously, a few years ago, BERT was the big news as a really powerful way of, representing the meaning of sentences and words in vector space. And those give you some very efficient foundations for building, really high quality machine learning models with a very small amount of labeled data that's specific to your domain. Then, of course, more recently, there's been even more hype about generative language models. So where you don't just say, okay, I'm going to predict what the chatbot has to say and choose from a template, but I'm really going to predict word by word or token by token the response and do like a full end-to-end prediction. Lots of really fantastic progress in that space. Also something we work on at Rasa. It's not something you can quite use in prime time yet because these models are very difficult to control. And so while they seem very impressive, of course, you can have some very impressive, conversations with GPT-3. But the two big problems are you can't really control what it says. So you can't really condition it on some factual knowledge. Of course, there's research in that area, but that's not something that's well established yet. And you can never guarantee that it's not going to say something offensive or irrelevant or otherwise problematic. So lots of promise in that area, but also lots of open questions before those kinds of approaches can really be used.
Thank you. Next question from Madhu Kumar. Agile and DevOps are a mindset factor in any organization. I often face difficulty dealing with some customer moving from legacy infrastructure and architecture to microservices. What is your take on this and convenience to the customers?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think the analogy with moving from waterfall to agile or moving to DevOps or something like that is an apt one, because these things don't happen overnight. And it's a shift in mindset, right? And you need sponsorship from, engineering leadership or your CTO or whomever else. That's the job of technical leadership, is to make that case and to rigorously assess, is this going to give us better results? Is this genuinely going to be good for the business? Or is this just the latest trend that people talk about, right? Like, does serverless make sense for our application, for our business? Or is it just the cool thing that people want to do, so that's why we're talking about it? That's the job of senior engineering and technology leadership, to make those calls. And if it's the right thing to do, then to back that up with a business case, right? And so I understand perfectly that if you're in a setup where perhaps you have clients and they're more short-term thinking than long-term thinking, if it's a consulting setup, then that can be quite challenging, of course. But it's up to us to prove that the new paradigm is better than the old one, right? And we have to bring evidence and we have to bring the cases forward. So it's always up to us to make that case.
Very good, very good. Follow-up question from Madhu. I'm working on a chatbot project, just checking what is the scope of chatbots in the future for customer service, retail, and banking domains.
Yeah, those are, I think, some of the biggest verticals where we see lots of applications of conversational AI. These kind of B2C applications where you have a huge breadth of customers and a huge array of products present a lot of really unique challenges and opportunities, right? You have retail, of course, you have so many SKUs, right? In a typical sort of retail chain that might be investing in chatbot technology. So you have to have, you have an opportunity to build in some real domain expertise, right? And that can be as simple as when you order your groceries online and you get a swap from one thing to another. Sometimes the swap can be really, really appropriate, right? We were out of this kind of tomatoes, so we brought you this kind of tomatoes instead. Sometimes the swap makes zero sense at all, right? And that kind of foundational knowledge that you have about your domain, you can use to build a much better chatbot experience as well, right? So that if users ask about something or talk about two things that are equivalent in your domain and are totally different in another domain, right? If I think about the word balance, right? How do we think about the meaning of the word balance without any specific context, right? We immediately think about, things being evenly distributed or weight, or we might think about political views being balanced, right? But of course, in a financial domain, balance means very different set of things, right? It means a balance on your account, which you hope is positive and large, or the balance on your remaining mortgage payments, which you might hope is small and will certainly be negative, right? So there are lots of opportunities in all of these domains to build on top of that domain-specific knowledge, something that won't drop out automatically from a pre-trained language model that isn't just going to figure that out for you, right? So, level 5 conversational AI is not going to arrive in a press release from Google or OpenAI or anybody else like that, right? Like, it's going to be work by domain experts in domains, multidisciplinary teams working together to build great experiences.
Okay, and then we have a question from Anonymous. The more a model is trained, the less it is accurate. How can you balance the model to keep it up to date without accuracy loss?
So in a typical development cycle with Rasa, as of version 2.7, I think, it's about a year ago now, we introduced incremental training in Rasa, which means that you can take an existing model that you trained in the past, you've only added a small amount of new data, And rather than doing a cold start, you can, just train a little bit, 10% as much as you normally would or something like that, do fewer passes over the data to just fine tune the model a little bit on the new data. Occasionally, it's still very good practice to just train from scratch, right? But more importantly, I think it's essential to have at least a basic ML ops setup, right? And ML ops is obviously a very hyped space at the moment, right? But in this particular context, what I mean by it is essentially doing regression testing on your models, right? So whether that's you have a reserved test set that you do evaluations on, or whether you just do a cross-validation of all the data that you have, you want some, like in your CI/CD pipeline, you want some mechanism for telling yourself, like, is my model getting better over time or is my model getting worse over time, right? That's a really crucial thing. And then, of course, there are lots of things that you might debug if your model's getting worse, like, am I adding data that's incorrectly labeled? Am I getting classes which are very imbalanced? All sorts of things might come into play there. But that's really also part of that track step of CDD, is to give yourself that visibility on how is my model doing today? Is that better than it was last time we did it?
Okay, and our final question for you. Do you recommend building chatbots which can answer dense questions as well as which rarely some users may ask, like, what is a bank? If not, what to do with such questions?
Yeah. Well, I think what the question is about is the long tail, right? So a message like hello will show up very often, right? And so that's, if you think about a distribution of how often different messages are sent, you have a few messages which are sent extremely, extremely frequently. And then you have a very long tail of all sorts of infinite crazy things that people will say that you might have never heard before, right? And the amazing statistic that Google always tell us is that every day, 15% of Google searches are for things that nobody has ever Googled before, right? After all these years, there's still people coming up with however many unique new things that have never been said before, right? And so these out of scope things, one very simple way to simplify the problem is to think of questions that are out of scope but in domain, like what is a bank? And then there are questions which are out of scope and out of domain, like, can I order a pizza if it's a banking bot, right? And you can start very simple, right? And just say, okay, I'm going to recognize if this is in domain, right? And then probably ask a follow-up question to figure out what this person really wants, right? And there might be things where the user's just kicking the tires, or they're just kind of being curious and being funny. Those are all perfectly valid things for a user to be doing. Or it might just be that, the user is phrasing things in an odd way and you have to help them differently, right? So I would start with broad categories of the types of, long tail questions that you get, and start to sort of divide them up into the more frequent ones, and start to, create ever more specific responses to those kinds of queries.
Okay, Alan, there are no more questions. Thank you very much. I'm
Thank you, John.
hoping that this, coupled with VR, is the first baby step to Star Trek holodeck experiences for me. But on another note, thank you for lending your expertise and your knowledge to us today and presenting. And we would like to present you with this little gift from us. It's a nice
Fantastic. Thank you.
Looks just like you. And we will be sending this in the mail to you.
Fantastic. Thank you all for listening, and thank you for hosting me.
Okay, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Same. Bye-bye.